Hey class, welcome to our last lecture on the Divine Comedy. We're going to be talking about the Paradiso today, and some of the different elements that we see in that are also reflected in the entire Divine Comedy. So I hope you guys have enjoyed listening to and reading some selections of Dante's Paradiso, which is part 3 of the Divine Comedy. Certainly a little bit harder to grapple with than the previous two sections, and I recognize that. But we're going to talk a little bit today about why that is. Why is the Paradiso a little bit harder to understand than some of the others? And I think there's a very interesting reason for that. So we're going to be talking about some various aspects, not only of the Paradiso, but also of the entire Divine Comedy as well. So let's talk a little bit about genre first, the style of writing that the Divine Comedy is. And this is really true for the entire Divine Comedy. It's true for the Paradiso, but it's true for the whole piece. The Divine Comedy is a very intentionally structured piece that is an epic poem. It is epic poetry. And this is the style of writing that we saw in works like the Iliad, the Odyssey. We didn't read the Aeneid, but the Aeneid was a big inspiration to Dante Alighieri, the writer. And so he has very intentionally mimicked a number of aspects of the epic in this work. He is intentionally creating a piece that is epic poetry. And we see this in a number of ways. It's written in poetic form. Hopefully you can see that a little bit as you've been reading. It's written particularly in a type of poetic form called terza rima, which is 3-line sections. It has a specific rhyme scheme and a specific meter in Italian, which is lost to us in translation, unfortunately. But there is that specific poetic style. And that was definitely true of the old epics that we read from ancient Greece, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were written with a very specific form. It wasn't terza rima, it wasn't the same poetic form, but they were written in a specific form of poetry called dactylic hexameter. The Divine Comedy is also divided into cantos. You probably noticed that there are a variety of cantos, smaller sections. This is very similar to the books of the Iliad and the Odyssey that we have, these divisions into smaller sections. So you have this larger work, but it's divided into smaller sections. And Dante imitates that as well. He has many more smaller sections than the ancient epics did, but he still does have it broken down into those smaller pieces. He also refers a lot to mythological figures, especially in the Inferno. There's quite a reference to a number of mythological figures in the Inferno, but he also kind of does another thing, and he refers to a lot of famous people throughout, not just in the Inferno, but also kind of famous Italians and so forth. He refers to throughout the text. That kind of builds in those references to mythological figures and to famous people, which are kind of some of the characteristics of the epic. He also calls for divine inspiration, and sometimes he actually calls upon the ancient Greek and Roman muses and kind of equates them with God and seeking inspiration from God. But ultimately, he's kind of asking for inspiration to write his poem from God himself, and kind of calling upon that inspiration. That was what we called the invocation in the ancient Greek poetry. And Dante actually has a number of invocations throughout his poem. Particularly in Paradise, he kind of goes through this series of invocations asking for inspiration to describe what he's seeing. And we see a lot more of that actually in Paradise than we did in Paradiso than we did in the other couple sections, the Inferno and the Purgatorio. So that call for divine inspiration is another characteristic of the epic. It's also epic because it deals with larger than life issues, and that's one of the things that an epic does. It doesn't deal with the small and the mundane and the everyday, but it deals with the extraordinary and the larger than life questions. Not the questions of where am I going to get food or what am I going to do today, but questions about existence and values and all that sort of thing. So some of these large questions that the Divine Comedy wrestles with are: how is the universe organized, right? Is there a sense of order to the universe? How do you save your own soul, right? Can you save your own soul? Do you need help from God? How do you use art? What is the best use of art? How does an artist like Dante use art to glorify God? And so these are big questions, not little questions. These are big questions about life and the universe and so many different things. Now, the Divine Comedy, while it is imitating the epic, and it is an epic poetry, it's a new kind of epic. It's a medieval epic, because it's not imitating everything about the epics of the ancient Greeks and Romans. There are some things about this that are very, very new and very different. And Dante makes some major departures in his epic, which means that this is a very different kind of work. The first thing is that our hero, Dante, is a very different kind of hero. The ancient Greek and Roman heroes were strong, invincible, clever. They were almost like gods, right? They were demigods. They were powerful. They were meant to be models of perfection. This is what you're supposed to be like. This is what you're supposed to strive to be. And Dante's not any of those. He's very, very different. Dante is weak. He's fallible. He's human. He needs help to get out of the dark wood of error. He has to have help from Virgil and Beatrice. He's constantly fainting. He's asking questions, admitting that he doesn't know the answers. He doesn't have knowledge or cleverness. He doesn't have a lot of physical strength. Virgil often has to help him through things. He is painfully aware of his own shortcomings and his own failures. As he journeys through hell and purgatory, he's constantly reflecting on, I recognize these sins and these problems in my own life, and I need to work on them. And so Dante is a very human figure, and that's very characteristic of the medieval period. The medieval period recognizes that humans are not perfect. They're not the pinnacle of perfection and idealization. While they may be the highest on the created order, right? They may be the top of the food chain when it comes to things that God has created. They're far from perfect beings. And you see this in the Arthur stories that we read. The knights are not perfect. And here again, Dante gets back at that idea. Human beings are far from perfect. And so we have a very new kind of hero in this story. Dante is heroic because he learns the lessons, he grows, he becomes closer to God, he becomes a better person. He's not heroic because he's great. In fact, he's an average sort of man. He's heroic because he's open to learning and growing and becoming the kind of man that God wants him to be. And that is the kind of hero that Dante is putting forward in this new kind of epic. Another thing that makes this different from the epics of the past is that the themes of the story are very different. The themes of Dante's epic are profoundly spiritual. They're interior questions. They're questions about the inner self, right? About your soul, about your relationship to God, things that can't be expressed physically. Whereas the ancient Greek and Roman epics were very much about physical expressions of values and beliefs, right? And it was very grounded in a physical world. It wasn't really grounded in the interior self, but more the exterior self. And so ancient epics were stories about battle and conquest and cleverness and overcoming and journeying and voyaging and language. And Dante's questions and themes are much more internal. And so the thematic focus of this as an epic is very, very different. Again, this is a much more medieval focus. We begin to see monks and monasteries and an emphasis on reflection and thought that appears in the medieval period. That was not quite as important for the ancient Greeks and Romans. They had philosophy and thought too, and a lot of really important philosophy that's influenced later traditions. But there was a lot more internal focus in some segments of medieval society. And so this is a very new kind of epic. It's a very medieval epic in the themes as well as in the hero. All right. So since we're talking about some of the different kinds of themes that the Divine Comedy wrestles with and how those are so different from some of the ancient epics, let's look at some of the key themes in the Paradiso and lessons that Dante learns from Paradise. One of the important things that Paradiso wrestles with is the idea of order and rules. Order and rules and law and structure were very highly valued in medieval society. Not that they always existed. In fact, the medieval world was characterized by a lot of brutality and chaos. Warfare was common. The justice system often determined whether you were innocent or guilty by an ordeal through fire, or an ordeal through water, or an ordeal through combat, neither of which really relied on proof, just whether or not you survived. And so the medieval world was quite brutal. It was quite chaotic. It arises in the fall of the Roman Empire, and there's a political vacuum. And though the feudal system does something to settle it down, Europe will be consumed by war for years to come because of the chaos and the lack of structure in the medieval world. And so that sense of brutality and chaos means that the medieval people value societies that are orderly and structured, and they see that as kind of the ideal society. It's why Arthur is a hero. He creates a structured, orderly society. And so they highly value order and rules. The Code of Chivalry was created to combat the chaos and the brutality that were a part of the medieval world. And so chivalry brings a sense of order. It's a code of how you're supposed to behave. It's a set of rules and guidelines. And so order and rules are very, very highly valued in the medieval world because they're necessary. They're necessary in order for people to be able to survive and function. But order and rules are also highly valued, and this is probably more pertinent to what we're talking about with the Divine Comedy, because Christians believe God is an orderly being. This is reflected all throughout the scriptures. God creates patterns, right? Like creation, evening and morning, the first day, evening and morning, the second day, all through 6 days, and then on the seventh day he rests, and that turns into a week, right? God creates a structured society for the ancient Israelites in the Old Testament. So God has this sense of order and structure. We see that reflected in many ways in the scripture. It's also reflected in creation, right? There are cycles of years and months, cycles of the moon, cycles of the tide, cycles of seasons, cycles of patterns in animals' lives, of mating season and birthing season and raising their young, and that cycle gets repeated. And so God is an orderly being who has created order to the universe. And thus heaven and the whole universe, all of the world, are orderly. And that is something that Dante has played with throughout the Divine Comedy. Even hell and purgatory have a sense of order and structure to them. And this is because it all reflects the mind of God. And this is one of the themes that Dante is wrestling with. He's looking at the character of God and saying God is an orderly being, and so he structures his text in a very orderly manner, and his imagination of hell and purgatory and heaven are all very orderly and structured. You may remember that this is one of the questions that Dante asks Beatrice on their journey through paradise. He says, so even in heaven there's a hierarchy. And Beatrice says, yes, everything is a series of steps, right? And this is because God is an orderly being. And so Dante has created this version and vision of it. Keep in mind, it's not really real, right? It's not the Bible, so it's not saying that this is real. I mean, heaven and hell are real, but Dante's particular versions of them are not necessarily real. But the idea of God as an orderly being is explained and examined through how ordered everything is throughout the text. Everything through hell and purgatory and paradise is all ordered because it's all a reflection of the mind of God. This brings us back to love as well. Remember, I told you last week that for Dante, one of the biggest things in the Divine Comedy is love. And this is because Dante believes God is love. That's a verse in the Bible, right? And we know that's true. God is love. So for Dante, this structure and order to the universe is motivated by love. He believes that every motion of the universe is motivated by divine love, by God's love, and that God always has humanity's well-being at heart, even in the things that seem harsh and cruel in hell. It is because God ultimately has humanity's well-being at heart. So Dante sees love as that driving force. And the people in hell, the way that Dante paints it, are the people who have willingly chosen to live outside of the love of God. And this is what happens because Dante sees that love for God is what gives our lives, what gives the universe its proper order. When we love God, we find our place in the order and structure of the universe, in the order and structure of divine spiritual society. But if we choose not to love God, we've chosen to live outside that order and structure. And therefore, that's why people end up in hell. Dante doesn't believe that God sends people to hell. He believes that people have willingly chosen to live outside of the love of God, and therefore have no place in the order and structure of the universe, because it is God's divine love and our love for God that gives the universe its proper order. So the people in hell are outside of that proper order because they've chosen to live outside of that order. They've chosen to live outside the order that is the love of God. Dante also represents God's love as light. And as he gets towards the end of his journey, he sees kind of God as the bright light in the center. And he has this really powerful picture. We didn't read this section, but there are 3 circles that are kind of interlocking. And in one of them is painted a picture of a man, which is a representation of the Trinity, and there's kind of light emanating from this Trinity. And he has this kind of last vision of everyone who is closest to God moving the fastest, moving in their proper order in divine love, and then kind of moving out from there. But all of it centered around this bright light that is the love of God. He describes it as a rose, and if you think of a rose has those center petals, right? And all the rest of the rose is just kind of layers out from the center petals. And so he pictures that as the ultimate picture of the universe, God at the center, and everything is circling around God. So some really beautiful imagery about love here, and Dante believes God is love, and that our proper place in the universe, our proper order and structure, which he highly valued in society, is found when we love God in return. One of the last things that Dante wrestles with is the inadequacy of language. And this is perhaps what makes Paradiso a little more tricky to understand than Inferno or Purgatorio. It's a bit more confusing because Dante's images here are kind of difficult for us to visualize. His images in Inferno and Purgatorio were very concrete, were very physical, and we could very clearly picture those things in our minds. However, the pictures in Paradiso aren't quite so easy to pin down. We have a hard time creating those images in our mind. And it's not Dante's fault. We know that Dante can help us create very good images. He proved that in the first 2 sections. He can create very clear images of something and have us as readers picture them quite clearly. But we can't quite see them so clearly in the Paradiso. So we have to think about, well, this is intentional. Dante can create really good images. What is he trying to accomplish here? There's also a lot more abstract thought. There's a lot less images and a lot more conversations between Dante and other people in heaven that are just kind of abstract about things like the nature of faith and hope and love that you guys read that section about in the Paradiso, where Dante's talking to several of the apostles. So there's a lot more abstract thought going on, a lot more conversations about deep philosophical, religious, and spiritual ideas between Dante and Beatrice and some of the other people. And so I think what Dante is getting at here is the idea he's trying to create in a literary sense. He's trying to use words to express that paradise is really beyond Dante's human understanding, that paradise is really beyond any of our understandings, and that our language, our ability to describe it, is always going to fall short. Words cannot adequately describe what character Dante has seen. They're never going to be able to adequately describe heaven. It's beyond words because it's God, and God is beyond our human limitations. And so there is this sense that language is never going to be able to fully express that. That's something we even kind of see in the book of John, or not in the book of John, in the book of Revelation, written by John in the Bible. John isn't quite able to fully express what's happening that he's seeing in his vision of the end times and of heaven. And so he has to physicalize it. It's why you have to do a lot of interpretive work in Revelation, because a lot of the things that John describes in Revelation are physical symbols of some sort of spiritual reality. And so he's trying to explain that in terms that we can understand. And so Dante is getting at a little bit of the same idea here. He's kind of saying paradise is beyond my ability to fully comprehend, and therefore beyond my ability to fully explain in language. And so author Dante specifically chooses to write a lot more abstract ideas and to make his images a lot less concrete, to kind of convey that idea that language cannot fully express the goodness and glory of God and paradise. All right, guys, so we've come to the end of our journey with Dante through hell, purgatory, and heaven in the Divine Comedy. I hope you guys have really enjoyed this work. I think it's really fascinating, and I really love teaching it. And I hope you've enjoyed learning about it as well. There's going to be a brief way to respond to this lecture, and so I encourage you to go ahead and do that. Over the next couple days, we're going to be getting review games up, and you guys will begin reviewing for your quiz on the Divine Comedy that will be on Monday, May 4th. So if you guys have questions, be sure to contact me. Make sure to read the instructions below and submit your assignment here. I hope you guys have a great day.